The flames cast eerie shadows across Nora Galloway's face as she stood frozen in the night, watching 20 years of her father's work crumble into ash and cinder. The barn at the Galloway ranch blazed like a funeral pyre against the New Mexico sky, and though her lungs burned from the smoke and her eyes watered from the heat, she couldn't move, couldn't even scream. By dawn, nothing would remain but charred timber and accusations. Steins Pass, New Mexico, 1885. I saw her, plain as day. Silas Matthews' voice boomed through the crowded general store where half the town had gathered by mid-morning. Standing there with that lantern, just watching it burn. Nora clutched her market basket tighter, shrinking against the shelves of dry goods. She'd come for flour and coffee, not to face a tribunal of her neighbors. "I never started that fire," she said, but her voice was lost beneath Sela's continued accusations. "My brother worked that land beside your father for 15 years, girl. When he died, your pa should have sold to us fair and square instead of letting a slip of a woman try to run a cattle operation." Silas advanced toward her, his bushy gray eyebrows drawn together like storm clouds. "And now you've gone and burned down your own barn for the insurance money. That's enough, Matthews." Sheriff Dawson stepped between them, his weathered face impassive. "Miss Galloway, I'll need you to come down to the office. Got some questions that need answering." "I didn't do anything wrong," Nora insisted, her throat tight. At 22, she'd spent her whole life in Steins Pass. After her mother died in childbirth and her father from a heart attack just 8 months ago, the townsfolk had shown her nothing but pity until now. "Then you won't mind explaining why 3 people saw you at that barn last night, would you?" The sheriff's hand settled meaningfully on her elbow. As they walked down the dusty main street, whispers followed them like snakes in the grass. The same neighbors who'd brought casseroles after her father's funeral now pulled their children closer as she passed. The sheriff's office was mercifully cool after the punishing New Mexico sun. Sheriff Dawson gestured for her to sit in the hard back chair across from his desk. "Now, Miss Galloway, where were you last night between 9 and 10 o'clock? "I was at home, reading. Then I heard the commotion and ran out to see." The memory made her stomach clench. "Sheriff, I would never burn down my own barn. That barn was my father's pride. He built it with his own hands." "3 witnesses say different," Dawson said, scratching notes with his pencil. "Silas Matthews, his son Jeremiah, and Widow Collins all claim they saw you standing by the barn with a lantern just before the flames took hold. They're lying. Or mistaken. I was nowhere near the barn until I heard the shouting." The sheriff leaned back, his chair creaking. "Got any proof of that? Anybody who can vouch for your whereabouts?" Nora's heart sank. Living alone on her father's ranch, miles from town, she had no alibi, no witness to her innocence. "The insurance man will be by tomorrow," Sheriff Dawson said. "Don't leave town, Miss Galloway. This isn't over." Walking home, Nora felt the stairs burning into her back. The ranch had been struggling since her father's death, everyone knew it. With cattle prices falling and the mortgage payments to the bank coming due, insurance money would solve her problems. That made her the perfect suspect. The charred skeleton of the barn greeted her as she crested the final hill to her property. Blackened timbers reached toward the sky like accusatory fingers. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. Tears blurred her vision as she walked through the debris. The barn had housed not just hay and tools but memories. Her father teaching her to milk a cow, to mend a bridle, to deliver a calf. All of it gone. Something glinted in the ashes near what had been the back door. Nora knelt and brushed away the soot, revealing a silver pocket watch. Not her father's, his was safely tucked in her dresser drawer. This one had an ornate R engraved on the case, Before she could examine it further, hoofbeats approached. Nora quickly pocketed the watch and stood, brushing ash from her skirt. A stranger rode toward her on a magnificent black stallion. He wore practical riding clothes, not the flashy getup of a gunslinger or the stiff suit of a city man. His face was tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. The stranger reined in his horse a respectful distance away. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Roy Yates. I was passing by and saw the damage. Mighty sorry about your barn." "Thank you, Mr. Yates." Nora didn't volunteer her name. Strangers weren't uncommon in Steins Pass, with the railroad bringing all manner through, but she'd learned caution. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. "Anything salvageable?" "Not much." She studied him warily. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Yates?" "Looking for work. I've done everything from breaking horses to driving cattle. Heard there might be ranches hiring around Steins Pass." Nora almost laughed at the bitter timing. "You're looking at what's left of the Galloway ranch." "I'm Nora Galloway, and until last night I might have needed help with the spring calving." "Accident." His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-browned skin, assessed the barn ruins with professional interest. "That's the question, isn't it?" Bitterness crept into her voice. "Half the town thinks I set the fire myself for insurance money." Roy Yates whistled low. "That's quite an accusation." "It's ridiculous is what it is. I would never." She stopped, embarrassed by her outburst. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear my troubles." Sometimes a stranger's ear is easier to bend than a friend's. He smiled, and for the first time since the fire, Nora felt something other than despair. "I've got some experience with fires, Miss Galloway. Mind if I take a look around?" Nora hesitated. This man was a stranger, yet something about his direct gaze made her want to trust him. "I suppose there's no harm in looking." Roy walked the perimeter of the ruined structure, examining the ground with the focus of a man who knew what he was searching for. He knelt occasionally to sift through debris, his movements methodical. "Fire had to start somewhere," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "A barn this size doesn't just go up all at once." "The sheriff didn't even look," Nora said, following behind him. "He just took Silas Matthews' word that I did it." Roy glanced up. "You have history with this Matthews fellow. His family's ranch borders mine. They've wanted our water rights for years. My father refused to sell to them, even when times got hard." She swallowed hard. "After Pa died, Silas offered to buy me out for half what the place is worth. Said a woman couldn't manage a cattle ranch on her own. Yet here you are managing, trying to." She gestured at the ruined barn. "This doesn't help matters." Roy continued his examination, making his way to what had been the back of the barn. Was there anything stored back here? Something that might catch easy, just hay and some old tack? Nora frowned, thinking. And the containers of coal oil for the lanterns. Coal oil would explain how fast it went up. Roy knelt and brushed away ash, revealing scorched but still recognizable glass shards. "Looks like where your fire started, Miss Galloway." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Nora turned to see Sheriff Dawson riding up, accompanied by Jeremiah Matthews, Silas's son, and the spitting image of his father except for his darker hair and leaner build. "Making friends mighty quick, ain't she?" Jeremiah sneered as they dismounted. "Found yourself a new hand already, Miss Galloway. Mr. Yates was just passing by," Nora said stiffly. Sheriff Dawson looked Roy over with professional suspicion. "You're new in these parts." "Just arrived today," Roy confirmed, extending his hand. "Roy Yates. I've been working ranches through Colorado and New Mexico for the past few years." Dawson shook his hand reluctantly. "What brings you to the Galloway place?" saw the burned barn from the road. Thought someone might need help. Miss Galloway's got enough problems without taking on drifters, Jeremiah said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Roy's boot. Roy didn't rise to the bait. I was just telling Miss Galloway that it looks like the fire started back here, with the coal oil. Sheriff Dawson frowned. You a fire inspector now, mister. Worked as one for the railroad for 2 years. Coal oil fires have a particular pattern. This wasn't no accident, but it wasn't started with a lantern either. Roy pointed to the ground. Someone poured coal oil in a trail, then lit it from a safe distance. You saying Miss Galloway is even more calculating than we thought? Jeremiah's hand drifted toward his holstered revolver. I'm saying whoever did this knew what they were doing. Roy's voice remained even. And wanted it to look like someone else's doing. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Yates. Just observations, Sheriff. I'll leave the accusations to the law. Nora felt a spark of hope. Here was someone who didn't immediately assume her guilt, someone looking at evidence rather than rumors. Sheriff, I've been telling you I didn't do this, she said. Maybe Mr. Yates is right. Maybe someone wanted to frame me. Jeremiah snorted. Who'd bother framing a woman who's about to lose her ranch anyway? Everyone knows you can't make the mortgage payments. Nora's cheeks burned. The state of her finances wasn't supposed to be public knowledge, but in a small town like Steins Pass, the banker's discretion only extended so far. That's enough, Jeremiah, the sheriff warned. Miss Galloway, the insurance man will still want to look things over tomorrow. Until then, I suggest you keep to yourself. He turned to Roy. And you, Mr. Yates. Steins Pass welcomes visitors, but we don't tolerate troublemakers. After they rode off, Nora let out a shaky breath. Thank you for speaking up. Roy dusted off his hands. Don't thank me yet. I just stated the obvious. Someone wanted that barn to burn and they wanted you to take the blame. But why? The only thing I've got that anyone would want is the land itself, and the bank will take that soon enough if I can't make the payments. Roy's gaze swept over the ranch, the small but tidy house, the fenced pastures stretching toward distant hills, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. Land and water are reason enough out here. The sun was beginning to set, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of orange and purple. Nora suddenly realized how improper it must look, standing alone with a strange man as darkness approached. As if reading her thoughts, Roy said, I should be getting on to town, find a room for the night. The only place in Steins Pass is Mrs. Beekman's boarding house, Nora said. Tell her I sent you, he nodded, then hesitated. Miss Galloway, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? After what's happened, being out here alone. This is my home, Mr. Yates, I'm not leaving it, she lifted her chin. Besides, I've got my father's shotgun. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I don't doubt you know how to use it. He mounted his horse with easy grace. I'll stop by tomorrow, if that's all right. I'd like to look around more in the daylight. I'd appreciate that, Mr. Yates. After he'd gone, Nora stood watching the road long after his figure had disappeared into the gathering dusk. The pocket watch she'd found seemed to burn a hole in her skirt pocket. She pulled it out, examining it more closely in the fading light. The watch was expensive silver with delicate engraving. The chain was broken, as if it had been yanked from someone's pocket. What was such a fine timepiece doing in her burned barn, inside the house? Nora lit the lamps and prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. As she ate alone at the kitchen table, she opened the watch again. The face was cracked from the heat of the fire. The hands stopped at 9:17. The time of the fire. Nora's hand trembled. Here was proof someone else had been in her barn when the fire started, but who did the watch belong to? And would Sheriff Dawson believe her if she showed it to him? She slept fitfully that night, the shotgun propped beside her bed, startling awake at every creak and settling of the house timbers. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She'd take the watch to Roy Yates first. If he truly had experience as a fire inspector, perhaps he could help her understand what it meant before she approached the sheriff. The next morning brought Mr. Holloway, the insurance man, a balding fellow with spectacles and a perpetual frown. He examined the barn ruins with exaggerated suspicion, making notes in a small leather-bound book. "Circumstances are highly irregular, Miss Galloway," he announced when he'd finished. "Given the witness statements suggesting arson, the company will delay any settlement until the investigation is complete." Nora had expected as much, but it still felt like another blow. Without insurance money, she couldn't rebuild the barn. Without a barn, she couldn't properly run the ranch. Without the ranch income, she couldn't make the mortgage payments. As Holloway drove away in his buggy, Roy Yates rode up, leading a packhorse laden with supplies. "Thought you might need provisions," he said by way of greeting. "Town's already talking about the insurance man coming out." "No settlement until they determine it wasn't arson," Nora confirmed, "which means no money to rebuild." Roy dismounted, tying both horses to the hitching post. "I've been thinking about your situation, Miss Galloway. I'm between jobs and you're short-handed. What if I stay on for a while?" "Help you get back on your feet," Nora blinked in surprise. "Mr. Yates, that's kind, but I can't pay ranch wages right now. Room and board would do for a start." His eyes held her steadily. "Truth is, I'm interested in this fire. Something doesn't add up." Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out the watch. "Like this, I found it yesterday in the barn debris." Roy took it carefully, turning it over in his palm. "This is fine silverwork, not something a ranch hand would carry." He opened it, noting the stop time. "Where exactly did you find it?" "Near where you said the fire started, at the back door." A grim satisfaction crossed his face. "Then whoever set that fire was there right when it started." He glanced up. "Anyone around here own a watch like this, with an R engraving?" Nora shook her head. "Not that I know of." "I thought it might be yours, actually, with the initial." Roy smiled slightly. "Mine's brass, not silver. Had it since my time in the Army." "Should I take it to Sheriff Dawson?" Roy considered, then shook his head. "Not yet. He's already made up his mind about you. We need more proof first." He pocketed the watch. "I'll make some inquiries in town, see if anyone recognizes it. Meanwhile, let me help you get the ranch back in order." "You don't even know me, Mr. Yates. Why would you go to such trouble?" Something flickered in his blue eyes, determination, perhaps, or a sadness Nora couldn't quite name. "Let's just say I've seen innocent people blamed before. It doesn't sit right with me." Over the next week, Roy proved himself invaluable. He repaired fences, checked on the cattle in the north pasture, and helped Nora clear away the barn debris. They worked side by side from dawn till dusk, stopping only for the meals Nora prepared. She learned he'd grown up on a ranch in Colorado, joined the Army during the tail end of the war, then worked for the railroad before returning to ranch work. He spoke little about family, and Nora didn't press. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep private. In town, the whispers continued. Nora felt the stares when she visited the general store, heard the conversations that stopped when she entered the post office. Only Mrs. Beekman treated her normally, confiding that Roy had moved out of the boarding house after 3 days. "Said he'd found work at your ranch," the older woman said, eyes twinkling with unmistakable matchmaking interest. "He's a fine-looking man, that Mr. Yates." Nora blushed. "It's not like that, Mrs. Beekman. He's just helping with the ranch until I can hire proper hands again." "If you say so, dear." Mrs. Beekman patted her hand. Just know not everyone believes those rumors. Some of us remember how much your father loved that barn." Back at the ranch, Nora found Roy digging through the last of the barn ruins, setting aside salvageable tools and hardware. "We could start rebuilding," he said as she approached. "Nothing fancy, but enough to store hay and give shelter to the horses." "With what money?" Nora sighed, sitting on an overturned bucket. "The bank won't extend more credit, and without the insurance settlement." "We could use the timber from the North Ridge," Roy suggested. "I noticed a stand of good pines up there. Wouldn't cost anything but sweat." Nora shook her head. "That timber is what's going to pay this quarter's mortgage. I was planning to contract with the sawmill next month." Roy frowned. "Then we need to clear your name and get that insurance money." He pulled the silver watch from his pocket. "I asked around town casually. No one admits to recognizing this, but Jeremiah Matthews got mighty interested when I mentioned a silver timepiece." "Jeremiah," Nora's brow furrowed. "Why would he burn my barn?" "Same reason his father wants your land. Water rights." Roy's expression hardened. "I've been studying your property. That creek that runs along your eastern boundary feeds into the Matthews Ranch, doesn't it?" "Yes, but they have access to it already." "Access isn't ownership. If they owned your land, they'd control the water completely." Roy sat beside her. "Jeremiah was one of the witnesses who claimed to see you at the barn, right? What if he was projecting his own guilt?" Before Nora could respond, Hoofbeats approached. Sheriff Dawson rode into the yard, dismounted, and hitched his horse. "Miss Galloway," he nodded curtly, then eyed Roy with suspicion. "Mr. Yates, I see you're still around." "Sheriff." Roy stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Nora. "Something we can help you with." "Got word you've been asking questions in town about a silver watch." Dawson's hand rested on his holster. "Care to explain why?" Nora stood too, her heart racing. "I found it in the barn ruins, Sheriff, after the fire." "Is that so?" Dawson's expression remained skeptical. "And you're just now bringing this to my attention?" "We wanted to gather more information first," Roy said evenly. "Given how quick folks were to accuse Miss Galloway without evidence." The sheriff's face reddened. "I'm the law in Steins Pass, Mr. Yates. Evidence is my business." He held out his hand. "The watch, please." Roy hesitated, then pulled it from his pocket and handed it over. Dawson examined it, his eyebrows lifting at the engraved initial. "R," he said, looking pointedly at Roy. "Like in Roy, perhaps?" "Or Richards or Robinson or a dozen other names," Roy replied calmly. "I arrived in town after the fire, Sheriff. Check with the station master. I came in on the evening train the next day." Dawson pocketed the watch. "I'll look into it." "Meanwhile, Miss Galloway, the insurance company has officially denied your claim. Evidence of arson, they say." He tipped his hat. "Good day to you both." After he left, Nora sank back onto the bucket, fighting tears. "That's it then. Without that money, I'll lose the ranch within 2 months." Roy's jaw tightened as he watched the sheriff ride away. "He didn't even ask where you found the watch." "He doesn't care," Nora said bitterly. "The whole town has already decided I'm guilty." "Not the whole town." Roy knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Nora, I believe you. And I'm going to help you prove your innocence." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in his voice made her look up and meet his gaze. The intensity there sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with her troubles. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't owe me anything." His hands tightened on hers. "Because it's the right thing to do," he paused. "And because I care what happens to you." That night, Nora lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, replaying Roy's words in her mind. He'd been at the ranch for just over a week, yet she'd come to rely on his steady presence, his unwavering belief in her innocence. It was more support than she'd received from people she'd known her entire life. And if she was honest with herself, there was more to it than gratitude. She'd begun to watch for his smile, to find excuses to work alongside him, to linger over supper conversation. It was foolish she barely knew him, and her situation was precarious at best, but the feeling persisted nonetheless. Dawn found her at the kitchen stove, preparing breakfast earlier than usual. Roy typically rose with the sun and checked the livestock before coming in to eat, and today she wanted everything to be ready. But when he entered the kitchen, his expression was grim. "Someone cut a section of the north pasture fence during the night. 3 of your best heifers are missing." "Rustlers?" Nora asked, her stomach dropping. Cattle theft was the last thing she needed, or someone trying to drive you further into financial trouble. Roy accepted the coffee she handed him. "I followed the tracks a ways, heading straight for Matthew's land." Nora set down her cup with a thud. "You think Jeremiah took my cattle? I think it's worth investigating." Roy's eyes met hers, but carefully. "If the Matthews family is behind this, confronting them directly could be dangerous." After breakfast, they rode out together to examine the cut fence. The clean cuts through the wire suggested bolt cutters, not the hasty work of opportunistic thieves. Someone had planned this. "We need to find those heifers," Nora said, surveying the damage. "They're part of my breeding stock. Without them, next year's calves will find them," Roy promised. "But first, let's repair this fence before more cattle wander off." They worked together, Nora holding the wire taut while Roy secured it. The morning sun beat down on them, and Nora was acutely aware of his proximity, of the way his shirt clung to his shoulders as he worked. "There," he said finally, sitting back on his heels. "That should hold. Now, let's see about those missing cattle." They followed the tracks across the rocky terrain, careful to stay on Galloway land. Near the boundary with the Matthews Ranch, the trail disappeared into a rocky wash. "They drove them through the water," Roy noted, scanning the opposite bank. "To hide the tracks. There." Nora pointed to a break in the brush on the other side. "They came out there," Roy nodded. "And that's Matthew's land. We can't go charging in there without proof or we'll be the ones in trouble." "So what do we do?" Frustration edged Nora's voice. Roy considered for a moment. "I'm going to town, see if I can learn anything useful, maybe find out who that watch belongs to. And I'll ride the boundary, make sure no more fences have been cut." He frowned. "Be careful, Nora. Whoever's doing this isn't playing fair." She touched the revolver at her hip. "I can take care of myself." "I know you can," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Meet back at the house by sundown." They parted ways, Nora heading east along the property line while Roy rode toward town. The day grew hotter, the New Mexico sun relentless. By mid-afternoon, she'd checked the entire eastern boundary and half of the southern line with no sign of further tampering. As she approached the creek that marked her property's edge, Nora heard voices. She reined in her horse and dismounted, moving quietly through the brush until she could see the water. Jeremiah Matthews stood knee-deep in the creek, directing 2 ranch hands who were constructing some sort of dam across the narrowest part. A cold fury rose in Nora's chest. The creek flowed through both properties, but diverting it would leave her land dry. "Make sure it's solid," Jeremiah was saying. "By the time she notices her water's drying up, it'll be too late." "Mr. Matthews might not like this," one of the hands said nervously. "He said to wait until my father's too cautious," Jeremiah snapped. "We've waited long enough for that land. The fire didn't drive her out, so we'll take her water instead. No water, no cattle, no mortgage payment. Simple." Nora's breath caught. There it was, an admission about the fire, if not a direct confession. She needed to get back to Roy, tell him what she'd heard. As she backed away, a twig snapped beneath her boot. The sound seemed deafening in the afternoon quiet. What was that? Jeremiah's head whipped around. Someone's there. Check it out. Nora ran for her horse, heart pounding. She just reached the animal when a shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark from the tree beside her. It's the Galloway woman, one of the hands shouted. She heard everything. Nora flung herself into the saddle and spurred her horse into a gallop, bending low over its neck as more shots followed. She rode hard for the house, taking the most direct route across open pasture. If she could reach home, get Roy's help. But Roy was in town. She was on her own. Behind her, hoofbeats thundered. Jeremiah and his men were in pursuit. Nora urged her horse faster, the wind tearing at her hair. The house came into view just as a burning pain seared across her upper arm. She cried out but kept riding, reaching the yard and practically falling from the saddle. She stumbled into the house, slamming and bolting the door behind her. Blood soaked her sleeve where a bullet had grazed her. Grimacing, she retrieved her father's shotgun from above the fireplace and loaded it with trembling hands. Outside, horses approached at a walk, cautious now. "Miss Galloway," Jeremiah's voice called, "come on out, we just want to talk." "You just shot at me," she shouted back. "Leave my property now or I'll have the sheriff on you for trespassing and attempted murder." Jeremiah laughed, the sound chilling her. "Sheriff Dawson. He's in my father's pocket, same as half the town. No one's coming to help you, Miss Galloway." "I've got a shotgun that says differently," Nora replied, moving to the window. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see Jeremiah and his two hands, spread out in a loose semicircle before the house. "You can't stay in there forever," Jeremiah called. "And we can't let you go to town with what you heard. Makes things complicated." Nora's mind raced. They couldn't afford to let her live now that she'd heard Jeremiah implicate himself in the fire, and Roy wouldn't be back until sunset hours away. A rifle shot shattered the window next to her. Nora ducked, heart hammering. She crawled to another window and fired the shotgun, not aiming to hit but to drive them back. The men scattered, taking cover behind the water trough and woodpile. "She's serious, boss," one of the hands said. "Maybe we should just burn her out like we did the barn." "And have the whole town see the smoke," Jeremiah snapped. "Use your head. We wait her out. She's wounded. I saw the blood on her sleeve. Won't take long." Nora pressed her back against the wall, fighting dizziness. Her arm throbbed, blood still seeping through the makeshift bandage she'd tied around it. They were right, she couldn't last long like this. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Occasionally, one of the men would fire at the house, keeping her pinned down. Nora changed position regularly, returning fire sparingly to conserve ammunition. The wound on her arm had stopped bleeding but burned like fire. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, she heard a commotion outside. A new voice, Roy's voice, rang out clear and commanding. "Drop those weapons." Now, Nora risked a glance out the window. Roy had somehow circled behind Jeremiah and his men. He sat on his horse, rifle aimed steadily at Jeremiah's back. "This ain't your fight, Yates," Jeremiah growled, half turning. "When you shoot at Miss Galloway, it becomes my fight." Roy's voice was cold. Guns on the ground, slow. To Nora's amazement, the men complied, perhaps seeing something in Roy's stance that convinced them he wasn't bluffing. "Nora," Roy called. "Are you all right in there? I'm here." She moved to the door, shotgun still ready. "I'm hit, but it's just a graze." "Keep these men covered," Roy instructed. "I'm going to disarm them properly." He dismounted, collected the discarded weapons, and marched the three men to the corral fence, where he bound their hands with rope from his saddle. Only then did Nora emerge, shotgun still trained on the captives. "What happened?" Roy asked, eyes darkening at the sight of her bloodied sleeve. Quickly, she told him about discovering the dam construction and overhearing Jeremiah's damning words. "He admitted it, Roy." He all but confessed to setting the fire. Roy's face hardened. And then tried to kill you to keep you quiet. He checked her arm, his touch gentle despite his obvious anger. This needs tending, but it's not too deep. Let's get these three to town first. The sheriff won't help us, Nora said. Jeremiah claimed Dawson is in his father's pocket. Then we'll take them straight to Judge Harper. Roy's eyes met hers. I found out a few things in town myself today. That watch, it belongs to Richard Matthews, Silas's younger brother. The storekeeper recognized it from the description, and Mrs. Beekman overheard an argument between Silas and Jeremiah the night after the fire, something about taking matters too far. Hope surged in Nora's chest. So we have evidence. We do. Roy helped her onto her horse, and now we have witnesses who heard Jeremiah confess. The two ranch hands looked at each other nervously. We'll testify, one of them said suddenly. We didn't know he meant to kill anybody, just scare her off the land. Jeremiah cursed. Shut your mouth, Peterson. He paid us to help with the fire. The hand continued, ignoring him. Said it was just property damage. Insurance would cover it. We didn't know he planted that lantern to frame Miss Galloway. Roy smiled grimly. That'll do nicely. They rode into Steins Pass as the last light faded from the sky. An unlikely procession, Nora and Roy leading three bound men on horseback. People emerged from shops and saloons to stare. Roy led them straight to Judge Harper's home, a stately two-story house at the edge of town. Judge Harper was a stern, white-haired man who dispensed frontier justice in the territory for 20 years. He listened impassively as Roy and Nora presented their case, the ranch hands confirming their story while Jeremiah glowered in silence. When Sheriff Dawson arrived, summoned by a neighbor, the judge fixed him with an icy stare. Interesting that you were so quick to accuse Miss Galloway based on witness statements, yet so slow to investigate any other possibilities, Sheriff. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. The evidence pointed to her, Your Honor. The evidence was manufactured, Judge Harper replied sharply, and I'll be looking into whether you were merely incompetent or actively complicit. He turned to Jeremiah. You'll be held for arson, attempted murder, and cattle theft. Your father will be questioned as well. As the judge wrote out formal charges, Nora swayed slightly on her feet. The events of the day, combined with blood loss, were catching up to her. Roy's arm came around her waist, steadying her. Let's get you to the doctor, he murmured. Doctor. Wilson cleaned and bandaged her arm, pronouncing her lucky that the bullet had only grazed her. By the time they left his office, word had spread throughout Steins Pass. People gathered on the boardwalk, watching them with new eyes. Mrs. Beekman pushed through the crowd, wrapping Nora in a gentle hug. I knew you couldn't have done such a thing, dear. You'll stay with me tonight, both of you. No arguments. The next morning, Judge Harper called a town meeting. The entire population of Steins Pass crowded into the church to hear him speak. Justice requires more than the law, he told them gravely. It requires a community willing to seek truth, not simply accept the easiest explanation. Miss Galloway was falsely accused, her reputation damaged, her safety threatened not just by the Matthews family, but by the willingness of this town to believe the worst of her. Silas Matthews had been arrested as well, after the ranch hands testified he'd known about his son's plan to burn the barn. The missing heifers were recovered from a hidden corral on Matthews' land. And the insurance company, faced with Judge Harper's stern directive and the evidence of Jeremiah's guilt, agreed to pay Nora's claim in full. As spring turned to summer, the Galloway ranch began to recover. A new barn rose where the old one had stood, built with the help of neighbors who now seemed eager to make amends for their hasty judgment. The creek flowed freely again, watering cattle that grew fat on the rich grass of the North pasture, and Roy Yates stayed. He'd offered to move on once the barn was finished, but Nora had asked him to remain as her foreman. In truth, she couldn't imagine the ranch or her life without him now. They were checking fence along the western boundary on a golden July evening when Roy finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. "Nora," he said, reining his horse alongside hers in the shade of an old cottonwood, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him, this man who'd believed in her when no one else would, who'd fought for her justice, who'd rebuilt her barn and her faith in humanity. "Yes, Roy, I came to Steins Pass looking for work, nothing more." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I never expected to find a woman like you strong enough to stand against a whole town, brave enough to face down armed men, kind enough to forgive those who wronged you." Nora's heart quickened. "Roy, I love you, Nora Galloway." He reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "I love your courage and your determination. I love this land because you love it, and I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." Joy bubbled up inside her like a spring. "I love you too, Roy. Yes, yes, I'll marry you." He smiled then, a smile that lit his entire face, and leaned across to kiss her, sweet and tender in the fading light. They were married in September, with the entire town of Steins Pass in attendance. Judge Harper performed the ceremony in the garden behind the Galloway, now the Yates ranch house, under an arbor Roy had built for the occasion. Mrs. Beekman wept openly during the vows. Sheriff Dawson, humbled by his part in the Matthews affair, but allowed to keep his badge after a stern probationary period, stood awkwardly at the back of the gathering. Even Dr. Wilson had closed his practice for the day to attend. "I pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Harper declared, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Yates, you may kiss your bride." Roy gathered Nora close, his kiss a promise of all the years to come. When they turned to face their guests, the applause was thunderous, a community making amends, celebrating new beginnings. At the reception that followed, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung from tree to tree, Nora found a moment of quiet reflection. A year ago, she'd stood alone watching her father's barn burn, accused by her neighbors, her future uncertain. Now she stood beside her husband, surrounded by friends, with the ranch thriving under their joint care. The new barn stood strong and proud, larger than the original. The mortgage was paid 6 months in advance, and most importantly, the truth had been revealed. Roy joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Yates?" The name still sent a thrill through her. "About how much can change in a year. About how finding the truth changed everything." "Finding you changed everything," he corrected softly. "The truth was just waiting to be discovered." Nora leaned against him, content in a way she'd never thought possible after her father's death. "Do you think we'll have a quiet life now that all the excitement is over?" Roy laughed. "Running a ranch, never quiet, but good, Nora, very good indeed." He was right, of course. The years that followed brought challenges, drought seasons, market fluctuations, the changing landscape of the territory as it moved toward statehood. But they faced each challenge together. 2 years after their wedding, Nora gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after her father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 18 months later. The children grew strong in the New Mexico sun, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with ranch chores as soon as they were able. The Matthews land was eventually divided and sold to several smaller ranchers after both Silas and Jeremiah served their prison terms. Neither man returned to Steins Pass, preferring to try their fortunes elsewhere, far from their disgrace. On the 5th anniversary of the barn fire, Roy and Nora stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. The ranch had prospered under their care, expanding to include additional pasture land purchased from one of their neighbors. "Do you ever think about that night?" Roy asked, his arm around her shoulders. "The night we met, sometimes." Nora looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. "I think about how close I came to losing everything. And then I think about how I gained so much more instead." Roy's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "I was just passing through, had no intention of staying more than a night or two. And then you saw a woman in trouble," Nora teased, and couldn't help playing the hero. "No," Roy said seriously. "I saw a woman who refused to be a victim, who fought for what was hers. That's what made me stay." He kissed her temple. "That and the fact that I fell in love with you about 5 minutes after I met you," Nora laughed. "It took me at least a day." Their life together wasn't perfect, no life ever is, but it was rich with love and purpose. The scandal of the barn fire faded into town lore, a story told to newcomers as an example of justice served. And if some versions of the tale emphasized the romance that grew from adversity, neither Roy nor Nora minded. 10 years after they married, they hosted a harvest festival on their ranch, a tradition they'd started to thank the community that had eventually embraced them. Tables groaned with food, fiddle music filled the air, and lanterns illuminated the yard as twilight descended. Nora watched her husband teaching their youngest child, 3-year-old Thomas, how to dance a simple 2-step. Their older children played tag with friends from town, their laughter carrying across the gathering. The new barn, no longer new but sturdy and weathered, stood as a monument to resilience. Mrs. Beekman, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, sidled up to Nora. "I remember when you were just a slip of a girl, taking over your father's ranch all alone. Look at you now." Nora smiled, watching Roy scoop up their son and spin him around, the boy's giggles infectious. "I'm not alone anymore." "You never really were, dear." Mrs. Beekman patted her hand. "Even when it seemed the whole town was against you, there were those of us who knew better. And then that handsome cowboy of yours rode in like something from a storybook." "He did, didn't he?" Nora's heart still skipped when Roy looked at her a certain way, even after all these years. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if he hadn't come along when he did." "You'd have managed," Mrs. Beekman said confidently. "You're your father's daughter after all, but I'm glad you didn't have to." So was Nora. As the evening deepened, and the celebration continued around her, she felt a profound gratitude for the life she'd built with Roy, a life that might never have existed if not for a false accusation and a silver pocket watch. The mystery of why Richard Matthews' watch had been at the scene of the fire had eventually been solved. The younger Matthews brother had confronted Jeremiah that night, trying to stop him. In the struggle, his watch chain had broken. He'd fled when the fire grew out of control, too cowardly to admit his knowledge of the crime, too conflicted to let Nora take the blame entirely. It was Richard who had anonymously sent word to the station master to expect Roy on that particular train, a small attempt at atonement. Roy found her gaze across the yard and smiled, that private smile that was hers alone. He excused himself from the dancing and made his way to her side. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" he asked, taking her hand, completely. She leaned against him, content in the life they'd built from ashes. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He kissed her under the New Mexico stars, surrounded by the land they both loved and the family they'd created together. The barn that had once burned now sheltered their livelihood. The town that had once accused her now celebrated her success. And the man who had once been a passing stranger now held her heart forever. Some in Steins Pass still talked about the barn fire, about how a woman falsely accused had found justice and love with the help of a cowboy who believed in her. But for Roy and Nora Yates, it was simply the beginning of their story, the first chapter in a lifetime of adventures shared, challenges overcome, and love deepened with each passing year.